From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
So it's February last year. It's a warm evening. We're in a bar in Phuket, holiday island in Thailand. And two men, both in their early 30s, are having a drink. They're both from Marseille. They both know each other quite well. They've both grown up in the sort of the rougher parts of the city. And they get on quite well. They're also drug dealers. They're not just drug dealers, they are the heads of two of the biggest drug dealing clans in Marseille. One of them's called Mehdi Abdelatif Laribi, although everyone knows him as Tik. The other guy is Felix Bangui, who's nicknamed the Cat. So they're there having quite an amicable drink, and for some reason, a row breaks out. We think that it's over a woman. Now, according to a driver from one of the gangs who happens to be present, Felix Bangui is getting a bit drunk and showing off. He then throws an ice cube at Laribi. And as the driver puts it rather graphically, after that, everything went to shit.
The story today, Gangs of Marseille, inside France's drugs wars.
My name's Peter Conradi. I'm the Europe editor of the Sunday Times.
Peter, tell us a bit about these two men and the sort of following each has, the gangs that they lead.
These are the two biggest drug gangs in Marseille. One of them, headed by Laribi, is known as DZ, which is short for Diaya, which is in the Algerian dialect of Arabic, means Algeria. So this is basically an Algerian gang. The other gang is called Yoda, from Star Wars, obviously, and that is made up of young men primarily from North Africa. These are not the only gangs in Marseille, but between them, they control a huge amount of the drug traffic in the northern suburbs of the city. And these two gangs between them have been blamed for most of the 49 drug-related killings that happened in Marseille last year.
And just tell us a little bit about that, because that incident, the throwing of an ice cube, a row over a woman in a bar in Phuket, doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't. I mean, this incident seems to be crucial because in retrospect, it appears to have sort of marked an end of an uneasy truce between these two gangs. Because the next morning in Marseille, 10,000 miles away to the west, a member of the DZ gang was shot at by a member of Yoda, the rival gang, at a dealing point, a place where they buy and sell drugs, in a place called La Paternelle, which is a housing estate in northern Marseille. Then a member of DZ retaliated by attacking a member of Yoda on a neighbouring estate. And the whole process then starts escalating, and the uneasy truce breaks down and a kind of warfare breaks out between these two gangs.
Peter, you're based in France, usually in Paris, but you know Marseille well. Just for people who haven't been there, just describe the city and describe the mix of people who live there.
Well, I mean, you can go to Marseille on holiday and you can think, this is paradise. This is a wonderful city. I mean, it's a big city. There are about 860,000 people that live there. It's France's third largest city. Go there as a tourist, you arrive at the railway station, perhaps. The bit for the railway station is a little bit rough, but that's typical of a lot of cities in a lot of countries. You go to the old port. It's full of bars, cafes, great ambiance. There are beaches there. The weather, of course, is great compared to Britain or even compared to Paris. But this is also a city. It's a port city. And port cities for time immemorial have been linked with crime. They've been linked with smuggling. The city itself became famous, or one could say notorious, back in the 70s, thanks to the French Connection, the 1971 American film with Gene Hackman, part of which was set in Marseille, telling of the drugs that were smuggled in and out of the city. But that was essentially French and I suppose Italian criminals primarily who were involved in various kind of smuggling operations. What we've got these days is a massive trade, largely in drugs, primarily in the northern suburbs of Marseille. Now, suburbs, banlieue in French, in France are not normally the kind of desirable leafy places that people might want to live in Britain. By suburbs, we mean collections of pretty grim tower blocks, maybe 14, 15, 16 stories, way out of town, often very, very badly connected by transport and so on, which over the years have been used as a dumping ground for the poorest people in society. In most cities, that typically means people who have an immigrant origin. And in Marseille, that's particularly the case because Marseille, since I suppose the 1950s, since the Algerian War of Independence, has had a very, very large Algerian population, Moroccan population, Tunisian population. So you have these housing estates that no tourist will ever go to, where there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of deprivation, and there is an enormous amount of crime.
So a lot of the refugees who are fleeing places like Algeria, they end up living on these estates. Have you been to any? What are they like?
They are just as grim, I think, as I've just described them. I went down there in response to a sort of an upsurge of violence that had caught the attention of the French media. And I was taken on a tour of the estates of northern Marseille by a very, very interesting young man called Amin Kesachi, who at the time when I met him was 19. Now, he is of Algerian origin. He was a product of this same society. And his elder brother had been involved in drug dealing and met a particularly grisly end in 2020 because he was attacked by a rival group. They shot him. He was then in the car, and his car was set on fire, which is a local speciality, unfortunately, among these crime groups that's known as barbecuing.
Oh.
Now, Amin could have followed his brother into the gangs. He didn't. He instead decided to do something about it. First of all, he said, I'm going to get a proper career for myself, so he's studying law. He also set up a charity to help young people to try and tackle the causes of deprivation, and also the reasons why so many young people down there go into crime. Anyway, so he took me on a tour of the suburbs of northern Marseille. We drove around, and you've got to imagine the scene. There are little clusters of tower blocks which are linked together by very large main roads. So, I mean, if you wanted to set out to make something brutal, unpleasant, inhospitable from the start, that would be the way to do it. So you drive around, and as you drive off one of these big main roads into the estate, typically scrawled on the wall will be numbers, which essentially are the opening hours of the drug dealing points. And sitting on a chair somewhere near the entrance from the main road will be a young kid who is essentially a spotter. And his job, as the name suggests, to watch out for the police and also to look for clients. So if a client drives in, typically someone who drives up from the city, perhaps, middle class, young people who want some cannabis, he will take them in to one of the buildings and they will be given the drugs and they pay their money and they'll leave and so on. Or if the police come, he will warn everyone else and they'll all scatter.
It's as open as that.
It is as open as that. And the police come, they do periodic inspections, they do periodic raids, everybody scatters, the police go, miraculously, they reform.
I take it this is the sort of place you wouldn't have felt safe without your guide. With Amin, he's managed to make a career for himself. I mean, what about his cohort, with people he grew up with, people he was at school with?
That was the shocking thing. I remember he was talking to me and he said he looked at a photo from his primary school the other day, and so many of his classmates are in jail for dealing drugs. I mean, what was interesting to me was how people actually get into this whole drug dealing business. And I mean, he says, a typical example, you get a young kid, maybe 8 or 9, that kind of age, primary school age. And the dealer or one of the spotters is sitting there and he says to the kid, I want a bottle of water, I want a bottle of Coke or something, go and buy me that. And so the kid goes to the shop, he buys the drink, he brings it back to the guy, and the guy gives him 10 euros. And for a little kid, 10 euros is a huge amount of money. And he says, the next time you work for me, you'll get more. That's how you kind of get them in. And then gradually the tasks will change. It won't be a matter of going and getting a drink. It'll be, can you sit there for a few minutes and let me know what you see? Or can you help this person and so on? And so these young men, and it's primary men, but also girls as well, get sucked into this and they gradually advance up the hierarchy.
Peter, we began by talking about this feud between two drug lords from Marseille in Thailand that has had horrific consequences across that area of France. There's a lot of that has now come to light because of a book that's been written about the drugs trade in Marseille. Stepping back, though, just give a sense, do we know how big that trade is?
I mean, to give an idea of the scale of this trade, I think you just need to take one of these drug dealing points in La Castellane, which is one of the suburbs in northern Marseille. And that apparently turns over almost £100,000 a day. Now, you've got to multiply that by a pretty large number because there are a lot of these individual points. And Bruno Le Maire, who was until recently the French finance and economy minister, estimated the total value of France's drug trade at anything between about 3.5 billion and 6 billion euros.
Wow.
Now, obviously, that's not all in Marseille, but a big chunk of that is in Marseille. The rest of it is in Paris, in Lyon, all the way across the country.
So it's a huge economy in its own right. That's the money. What's actually fueling the violence now? I mean, you mentioned the feud, but why else is it now suddenly kicking off?
I think the feud is important because normally with gangs, be they in France or in Italy or in the US or anywhere else in the world, when things are relatively stable, everybody has their own territory and everything is fine. You don't need to get violent with the rival gangs because everyone knows where their place is, as it were. So when that begins to break down, then things turn violent, and when someone carries out an act of violence against a rival, then inevitably there's retaliation. So that has played an important part. In terms of how you actually assert yourself, you've got growing availability of weapons. There's been a suggestion that the Ukraine war has made that problem worse because the price, certainly when I was down there last year, the price of apparently Kalashnikov assault rifles has dropped from about 500 euros a gun down to about 300 to 350. So,
that's because of the Ukraine war.
There are such shipments of weapons to the war that some of them then kind of leak out and find their way back westwards. I think there was a similar phenomenon that happened at the time of the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. And I think a third, perhaps even more important factor is just the growing role of social media. Because traditionally, all these gangs would be very much locally based. You get sucked into it through friends, through elder brothers, through neighbors, and so on. What is happening now, and this happened to a great extent during lockdown, the gangs had to modify the way that they behaved. And so they started to recruit people online. It sounds absolutely extraordinary. And it wasn't just on the so-called dark web, but it was on the sort of more obvious kind of social media platforms that everyone uses. So you could be living anywhere else in France and you could do jobs for a Marseille gang. And what has happened in particular is that they've realized that there is an advantage in recruiting people online who come from elsewhere, who are then brought in, perhaps from Paris or anywhere else in France, to come to Marseille, to do a hit, and then to disappear again back to where they came from.
Wow. Almost like a rent-a-gun.
Exactly. And they're doing it on Signal, they're doing it on Telegram, they're doing it even on Snapchat, a platform which is used by countless teenage boys and girls.
And Peter, that seems to be a big part of this, because the age of people who are getting involved, not just in the drugs trade, but also in the killing and in the violence, is quite alarming.
What I know is drawn largely from the book Tueurs à gages, which is essentially Hitmen, which has been written by 3 crime journalists from Le Parisien, a French newspaper. And what they say in the book is that the overwhelming majority now of hitmen are aged between 16 and 20, with a few in their early 20s. And these young killers have a great advantage as far as the gangs are concerned. Because, first of all, in most cases, they're not known to the police. They don't have criminal records, or if they do, it's something only very, very minor. And so they can move around without fear of being detected by the police in the same way that a sort of a more hardened criminal would be. So these people are being recruited, and often the deal will be they will get sent perhaps a train ticket, or they'll even have a hotel room booked for them. They'll be told how to access a weapon. They don't know the person in most cases that they're being called on to shoot. They don't even know why they've got to shoot him. They're just being given this contract. One feels that it's almost something like living out a fantasy. It's almost as if they're in a film or they're in a computer game.
And Peter, you wrote about one instance in particular, which I found utterly shocking, about a 15-year-old who, as you say, was dispatched with a gun and given a hotel room in order to carry out an assassination. Just tell us what happened to him.
Well, he was actually hired not to carry out an assassination, but just to go to the apartment of someone from the rival gang and set fire to the entrance of the apartment to scare the person that lived there. It was to send a message. And he was from the DZ gang, but in this case, the DZ gang wanted to teach a lesson to another smaller gang called the Blacks. And they're so called because they come essentially from the Comoros Islands in Africa. So he went there to set fire to the doorway. As he was on the way into the building, he was intercepted by some members of the Blacks gang. They started to question him. They kind of worked out what he was planning to do. they searched him, they found the gun, and they all attacked him. They stabbed him, according to police, about 50 times, and then they set fire to him while apparently he was still alive. Absolutely awful. And so, of course, this led to retaliation. Another young man was dispatched, in this case, a 14-year-old, who went back to the estate to try and punish those who'd been responsible for killing the 15-year-old. So he got into a Bolt car, a kind of taxi that he got on through one of the apps. And as he was being driven along, he spotted out of the window of the car the person he thought that he had to shoot in retaliation, asked the driver to stop. The driver refused to stop. And at that point, he got the gun out and allegedly shot the driver point blank in the back of the head and killed him. Now, he was then detained by police. And why was he detained? He was detained because the guy who'd apparently commissioned him, a member of the DZ gang, who was in jail himself, yet had managed using a smuggled phone to recruit him, was so angry that the 14-year-old had messed up that he then called the police. He told the police where this 14-year-old was staying, where he'd deposited the gun, the rubbish bin in which he'd thrown the gun after shooting the taxi driver, and they went along and arrested him.
I mean, this is a horrific cycle of violence involving children, really. Peter, we started off by saying so much of this began with a feud between two big dealers, Tick and the Cat, in a bar in Thailand. What's happened to them since then?
Well, since then, Laribi appears to have gone to Algeria. We don't know quite where he is in Algeria. He's sort of lying low there. The French would obviously like to extradite him back to France, but relations between France and Algeria are pretty tricky at the moment. Algeria is not really extraditing anyone. So one can assume that, he's just going to stay there. Bangui is in Morocco. He's been arrested in Morocco. The Moroccans have much better relations with the French, and the expectation is that he will be extradited to France. But as ever with these things, it takes some time.
And does the fact that they're both out of the country, does that help in any way? Does that mean the war is nearly over?
No, I mean, I think these days, geography doesn't really play a role at all in these things. Again, if one goes back to the old days, it was all very physical. That the boss was there, if not on the estate, somewhere nearby. The various kind of people that form the various layers underneath him were also there. These days, because of social media, it's all much more spread out. The real big bosses, in most cases, are not in France at all. Often they're in Dubai, or as we've seen in these cases, they're in North Africa. So, thanks to the smartphone, it doesn't really matter where you are. So the big boss is living it up in Dubai. He sends a message to someone in middle management who may well be in a jail somewhere in France. And the guy in middle management will then recruit one of the kids on the ground. So, it's an international business in every sense of the word.
Peter, what are the solutions? What do people think should be done to try and combat this problem?
How do you deal with the drug trade? It's a problem not just for France, it's a problem for everywhere in Europe, for everywhere in the world. Different places have gone down different routes. There is one school of thought that says, okay, if you decriminalize cannabis, you will kind of remove a whole layer of criminality. If you were to decriminalize heroin, you'd remove another layer of criminality, and so on and so on. You could just legalize everything. You could allow people to buy and sell drugs just in the same way that they buy and sell alcohol or cigarettes and so on. Now, that would be very, very radical. A lot of countries are prepared to legalize cannabis. Are they prepared to legalize the open sale of heroin? I suspect not. So you then get a situation where if you have fairly liberal laws as far as cannabis is concerned, as say the Netherlands has, you then find that the gangs that were doing cannabis just do something else where the profits to be made are greater. So then again, the Netherlands has liberal policy on cannabis, but an enormous problem with drug gangs as well. Then how do you stop kids being recruited into gangs? I mean, Kasachi, the young man who showed me around the estates, had very, very strong views on this. And his argument was, well, this is all about social deprivation, neglect of the suburbs in France. If you provided better career paths for these young men, they wouldn't end up being sucked into this business. But over the years, an awful lot of money has been invested in the suburbs, an awful lot of money has been spent in new facilities, in educational opportunities, all this kind of stuff. Yet the allure of drug dealing is considerable because, you know, you have the impression, or you're given the impression, that this is a way out of poverty. This is a way of earning huge amounts of money relatively quickly. So you've got to, I think, advance on all fronts. You've got to deal also with cultural issues. You've got to somehow convince people that this is not a path to go down. And parents, obviously, as well, have to play a role in this. They have to keep a closer eye on what their kids are up to. I mean, but if the parents themselves are involved in this business, and that was the case with one of the 14-year-old kid who shot, or allegedly shot, the taxi driver. Very little is known about him. His name hasn't been revealed. But what we do know is that both his parents are in jail for drug dealing.
And Peter, what about politically? You know, we know Macron, for example, turned up in Marseille unannounced earlier this year in order to try and do something, to try and tackle the problem with various programs. But what are they actually doing, and is any of it working?
Macron himself is particularly attached to Marseille. He kind of travels there a lot. For some reason, it's meant to be a city that he's really concerned about and interested in. But, you know, what can you do? You can step up enforcement. You can flood these areas with police. But you need an awful lot of police. And is that really going to deter the drug dealers? Or are they just going to get smarter? They're just going to wait until the police have gone? I mean, you can't permanently occupy every housing estate with large numbers of policemen. I suppose the other thing that one should look at is, you know, the demand for these drugs. Typically, the demand for drugs is being driven not by the people that live on the estates, but it's being driven by middle-class people who live in Marseille, who live in Paris, who live across France. People who maybe like to relax with some cannabis, or who maybe want to, you know, sniff a few lines of cocaine or whatever. And I think those people have got to also realize and acknowledge that they are part of the business. They are the demand. If there wasn't this demand, then there'd be no drugs business.
And finally, Peter, how is the local community responding to all this? Because if you live in Marseille, I imagine the violence must be intolerable.
Again, it depends which part of Marseille you live in, because if you live in the kind of the pleasant middle-class parts of Marseille, this kind of stuff largely passes you by. The real burden is on the people who are living in these estates. They're living surrounded by kids who in many cases are armed, who are a bit trigger-happy. Crime, it's going on all around you, and if you're just trying to live a normal life, it's intolerable, it's awful. And from time to time, there are protests, there are demonstrations, particularly when people die, or particularly when people who are not part of the gangs are killed. But it just doesn't change anything about the reality of the situation.
That was the Sunday Times Europe editor, Peter Conradi, and you can find all of his reporting on Marseille at thetimes.com with a subscription. If you'd like to hear more about the drugs trade, why not listen to our series, Cocaine Inc.? We've put a link to it in the notes for this episode. The producers today were Edward Drummond and Olivia Case. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.